help me welcome William Meader.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, thank you. It's good to be back. This is my third time, and as I said last time I was here, it's special because even though I live in Oregon, I was actually raised in Minnesota, and in 1977 moved to the West Coast. But actually I was raised right by Lake of the Isles, so every time I come back here, it's coming back to the nest in a way. So anyway. This subject today, the title of my talk is The Cry of Humanity. And it's a little bit different than the two previous talks. So the first time I came here, the emphasis was on trying to understand how the esoteric philosophy looks at the nature of soul itself, and also the soul's creative destiny, the magical process of the soul. That was the first time I was here. We touched on that. Last year when I was here, I got into a whole discussion with you about the 7 rays and tried to help you understand that there are understood in this philosophy to be 7 types of souls, 7 unique types of consciousnesses, and that each is gifted and each will tend to look at the world in a different way. Each ray is like a lens that life looks out to try to understand how to act and interpret and react. And each will be inclined to serve humanity in quite different ways. So last year we touched on that. So in both of those cases there was quite a bit of emphasis on the personal aspects of the path. Today what I want to share with you is a little bit bigger picture. This has a lot to do with understanding the current situation esoterically from on a global level, and how to understand how this philosophy tries to interpret what's happening here. The cry of humanity, I don't know if you've noticed it, but it's pretty weird out there these days. Have you noticed? And it can be very disheartening. And at the same time, there's reason to be optimism is worth your while as well. So let me first stage this by highlighting a principle that is central to this talk. And that is that all of humanity in this philosophy is actually understood as one entity, one being, one unit of livingness. And that entity is constitutionally the same as you and I. All of humanity has a soul, and there's also the personality of humanity. And that entity called humanity is evolving its consciousness over the vastness of time, and that its method of evolution is precisely the same as the microcosmic reflection of that called you. Because you have a soul, and you have a personality, you have a higher consciousness and a lower consciousness. And so much of the journey for us individually, so much of that has to do with trying to transform the lower, the personality, so that it becomes the rightful servant to the higher, the soul, because that's the destiny of every human personality. The destiny is for the soul in you wants to express through the personality. It wants to do it without the personality getting in the way. And by the way, there's the challenge. And in so doing, it wants to make an uplifting contribution to the betterment of something beyond yourself. And that's service. So the whole human evolutionary journey is a journey of transforming the lower in support of the higher, and yet the lower doesn't let go of the reins very easily. Have you noticed? Have you noticed that sometimes you really kind of feel like you're on the beam? You really feel like you're really coming a long way in your spirituality, and then you start to plummet and you find you lost it. And so there's a push and pull here. You know, you have those deep spiritual moments, but then eventually the personality pulls you back and says, not so fast. And then you have another moment, not so fast. And so, in a way, the whole spiritual evolution of a human being until enlightenment is like a roller coaster, in a way. And it's a drama between having to do with the duality of consciousness in the human kingdom. And it's only true in the human kingdom. In this philosophy, it's understood that there's a whole understanding of the evolution of consciousness in the animal kingdom, the evolution of consciousness in the plant kingdom, even in the mineral kingdom, and even kingdoms above. But the human kingdom is unique in that it's said that in the human kingdom life begins to introspect, and life begins to become aware of awareness. And in that process of human beings slowly coming to the realization of individual thought and the capacity to be aware of awareness, in that process there's an eventual discovery. And that discovery is that you've discovered there's two of you in there, not one. And you don't want to say that publicly because they could lock you up. But the point is that you discover your own duality, and in this philosophy it's understood that you start the spiritual path in a more conscious way when you discover your own duality deep within. And then there's this battle that goes on between those two to transform the lower to support the higher. I say that only because I want to really highlight the idea that that's the foundation of the process for humanity as a whole. Humanity is a single living entity with a soul and a personality. And those of you who were here last time, when I talked about the 7 types of souls, and I shared with you what the 7 ray types, what I don't think I said to you yet last time is that principle of 7 types of souls doesn't only apply to individual human beings, but it also applies to the soul of humanity itself. The soul of humanity is said to be a 4th ray soul, a 4th ray soul. And the simple way of understanding why that is because we're the 4th kingdom. The 1st kingdom is the mineral, the 2nd kingdom is the plant, the 3rd is the animal, and the 4th is the human, and there's 3 above. But the point is that we are the 4th kingdom of nature, and that ray has a name. It's called the ray of harmony through conflict. That's what it's called, harmony through conflict. It's not called the ray of harmony and conflict. It's in the human kingdom, and only in the human kingdom, where there's going to be a battle and crisis that facilitates evolution. It's built into the very fabric of the evolution of human consciousness. And that battle isn't fully resolved at 100% until full enlightenment. So that principle applies on the global scale as well. Crisis always is a prelude to an expansion of consciousness. Tension, conflict is going to be a burning ground period leading up to an expansion opportunity. And if you think of your own life, I certainly look at my own life, I can honestly say that in my life, when I've gone through difficult transitions, they always are. There's a kind of difficulty with it. There's a kind of crisis before something changes. And if you think about your own life, I bet you would find the same thing. Whether it's a relationship crisis, maybe it's a career crisis, a financial crisis, whatever it is said that crisis is always at the front door of major expansions of consciousness. And in the ancient occult literature, that crisis is called the burning ground. The burning ground. And it's true for an individual, but it's true for the collective as well. The burning ground of humanity. And that's what esotericism has said is going on at this transitional time in history. We're walking the burning ground collectively. And the major issues that are striking for humanity today, whether it's environmental or economic or social, all of those crises are actually now have manifested on a global scale, which was what we would anticipate if it's all about the whole of humanity going through a transition. And so, in a way, the crisis that we see in the world today is not only something that it's predictable. It's not surprising. In fact, it would be shocking if it didn't occur. Because we are in what is said to be 2 major transitions in the big picture over the vastness of time. We are in an astrological transitional period between the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius. We are also going through a rayological transition in the larger context between what is called the 6th ray and the 7th ray. And all social systems, all cultures, are struggling with this transition in some way, shape, or form. And when we talk about the movement from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius, it's not like one day one ends and the other begins. Most astrologers would put it at about a 200-year overlap. And we're about at the middle. We won't be fully into the age of Aquarius without any Pisces overlapping it until the year 2117. So we're at the midpoint of this overlap transition. And that in itself is telling, because it's at the midpoint where we would have the greatest polarities arising. You see, that's the root of it. The root is that let's just look at it from an astrological perspective for a minute. What we're saying is that for the last 2000 to 2100 years, the sign of Aquarius has had a very subtle, though global, shaping effect on the subtle patterning of human consciousness collectively worldwide. And yet Aquarius is coming in with an overlap, and it's trying to support another kind of patterning of human consciousness, another kind of archetypal way of organizing perception. And those two are coexisting in the collective consciousness today. And because you have those two coexisting collectively today, that is triggering more and more polarities. Have you noticed? The dualities and polarities are just extreme, because there are some people that will naturally be attracted to the Piscean rhythm, and there are other people that are finding themselves naturally attracted now to the Aquarian rhythm. And those polarities manifest in education, science, the arts, government, religion. And so it triggers crisis. It triggers crisis. And because it plays out in all social systems, it's not just the world as a whole, but it applies on other scales as well. For instance, I mentioned earlier that this philosophy will say that all of humanity is one living being evolving over time. But it's also true that nations are entities. The United States is not just a country, it's a being. It's a living being. And it has a soul, and it has a personality, and it's struggling to transform the lower in support of the higher, just like you and me. And those nations are also governed by rays. So when you really get into the study of the rays, for instance, the United States is said to have a 2nd ray soul, which is called the ray of love and wisdom, and it has a 6th ray personality, which is called the ray of idealism and devotion. And the dynamics between those two set up the nature of the crisis, and that different ray dynamics between soul and personality will play out different forms of crisis because they're different in their natures. So that's another thing you have to understand, is that it's not just all of humanity is one and has a soul and personality, but so do nations. And on a little bit lower scale, the same is true with social institutions. Business, for instance, is not just a social institution, it too is an entity. It too has a soul. It too has a personality. Science, the arts, government, religion, all of those are categories of human consciousness, essential categories of human consciousness, evolving over the vastness of time, and that they too are going through crises. And so all of this is happening simultaneously at this tremendous overlapping period between Pisces and Aquarius. And everybody's feeling the pain of it, the pain of it. So that's an astrological way of looking at the nature of the struggle of humanity today, in a certain sense. Another thing to keep in mind is that we have a rheological change as well. Now, without getting too far into all the rays again, I kind of did that last time, but I said earlier today, I said that there is a transition between a sixth ray age and a seventh ray age. Well, the sixth ray is also called the ray of idealism and devotion. And it happens that the sixth ray is the ray that underpins all theologies around the world. That's another thing to keep in mind. It's not just that you have a soul ray or you have another soul ray. Social systems are also entities, and they have a soul ray collectively. So all of theology, all of religion, in its kind of mainstreamness of it, all religion is sixth ray, because all religion has at its core, at its essence, a note of devotion and a set of ideals. It's devotion to a philosophy, a teacher, a guru, a savior. And that sixth ray has been very, very strongly playing out for many, 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 many centuries. But it too is cyclic, like everything is cyclic. It too has a waning and a waxing period. And these ray cycles, some of them last for centuries and others last shorter periods of time. So it's a tapestry. But the idea is that the sixth ray has been a very dominant force throughout for the last several hundred years, actually the last couple thousand years, and it's pulling back. It's pulling back. It's completed this cycle for now, or it's completing, I should say, its cycle for now. We think that it has probably another 100 years to go before it'll have its full pullback. But in that pullback, that too is causing crisis, because it represents an energetic foundation that is no longer as dependable as it used to be. And it's true in all social systems, but none more than theology. Of all the departments, and we call in this philosophy these social systems, these are called the great departments: the department of government, the department of education, the department of economics and business, the department of the arts and culture, science, religion. These are departments, and each is going to be affected by the withdrawal of this quality of the sixth ray, but none more than religion. None more than religion. That's why, if you look at mainstream theology, not so much alternative theology, which is much more along this line, but, many of the churches are nearly empty, with the exception of the fundamentalist movements in all religions, which are, those are growing. Those are growing. I mean, look, just turn on the television, you'll see, in this country, you'll see evangelists filling stadiums of people. But that's actually a manifestation that's also predictable, because it's all about turning back out of fear, back to the basics. So much of the rise of fundamentalism, whether we talk about it from a Christian perspective, or we're talking about it from an Islamic perspective, or we're talking about, let's say, the rise of Hare Krishnaism in India, it's still a reaction out of fear of moving forward, and a tendency to turn back to the past out of that fear. And so you have a lot of people that are identifying with old ideas to try to make sense of life. But what's really trying to happen here? What's really trying to happen is that humanity itself is trying to figure out how to be one. That's what's really going on. And if we don't figure that out pretty soon, we're all in big trouble. Okay? And what's happening is a lot of fears are rising up in that process, whether it's national fears, religious fears, gender fears, xenophobic fears that are coming into play. All of these are reactions out of fear, having to do with this idea of losing something in order to move to a wider oneness. You with me, everybody? Is everybody tracking this? And so we see a lot of oppositional energy to what must happen. And that too is predictable. That too is predictable. It is said by a great master of this philosophy that the greatest hindrance in the world today at this remarkable transitional period is what he called, quote, the heresy of separateness. The heresy of separateness. And if you really think about what's happening here, you see the note of separateness rising up all over the place in opposition to what's really trying to happen. So, and the United States, because it has a sixth ray personality, its lower nature is sixth ray, and because that sixth ray is pulling back, America has a unique problem in its own right. Aside from the astrological transition, we have a strong intimacy with the initial, the sixth ray qualities. It was the sixth ray in our country that helped form it. The sixth ray also kind of creates in human consciousness a pioneering spirit. We can do it. The founding fathers were governed by a lot of the sixth ray, as well as the religious freedom from Britain. And so much of our country had a strong sixth ray quality right from the beginning. It's what led to much of the principles of the Constitution were based upon the sixth ray as well. And this is why now even some of our constitutional ideas are looking like they're not going to support us as they used to. So America has a unique problem because it has to rise more into its second ray soul nature. Now the second ray is called the ray of love and wisdom. And in its best expression, that quality of consciousness has so much to do with recognizing and honoring and doing things that support the oneness of things, but it's oneness realized through an honoring of diversity. It's not oneness based upon sameness, but oneness based upon the sacredness of differentness. And that's the call of the future, to move that way. So the United States has this unique problem that many other countries that don't have so much sixth ray in their system playing out. Okay, so in that thought that I've laid out here, one of the things to understand is how to interface your life with that. You know, it is said that the soul itself, the human soul, is governed by 7 laws. And the third law is called the law of service. Every human soul wants to make that uplifting contribution, but it has to do it through an outer garment. And that garment is what we call personality. And there's 3 parts to that personality. There's a mental component to it, an emotional component to it, and a physical component to it. But your soul is a cell within the soul of humanity. In other words, you as a soul are not separate from the soul of humanity. You as a soul are a constituent part of the soul of humanity. And so to the extent that you, in your personal life, can move deep inside you, and you can actually start to hold yourself in this subtler, wiser place deep within, the more you become an agent in support of the soul of humanity. In a way, that's who we serve, the soul of humanity. And you do that by recognizing the soul in yourself and being inclined to follow its impulses, its intuitive promptings, its wise counsel. Regardless of what ray your particular soul is on, collectively you are part of the soul of humanity. And so when you're aligned with your soul, you, without realizing it, are also aligned with the soul of humanity. When you are not aligned with your soul, when you are more being your personality, at that moment you are aligned with the personality of humanity, which is much more inclined towards separative perspective. Always one of the big differences between soul and personality is the personality is based upon separative consciousness. The soul in you is based upon unitive consciousness. The personality in you is the part of you that says, look at how I'm so different than that person. In fact, the personality is most attentive to contrast and difference. And out of that comes envy or pride or ego. But the soul in you is not looking at that. The soul, when you look at another person and you say to yourself, I feel a deep connection, as if I and that other person have a deep connection. When you're experiencing that, at that moment, it's your causal body, your soul, that is shaping that perception. So one of the most fundamental distinctions to be alert to in your own life is the distinction between when are you manifesting separative perspective and when are you manifesting unitive perspective, because that is a clue. That's a clue. You see? And so, what I'm really wanting to have you understand here is that this critical time in there's no guarantee that we're going to cross this threshold. I'm optimistic, but I think in the short run I'm pessimistic and optimistic in the long run. We're walking the burning ground. And the masses out there, they're living their life from a personality perspective. They're living their life that way, and that's not a criticism. Not at all, because that's just a stage of evolution. That's just a stage. For thousands of incarnations, your goal was to integrate your personality, to develop it, to be an integrated ego in the outer world. And that's a necessary phase before the soul becomes much more operative and wants to start taking control. So I'm not criticizing the masses for not being guided by their soul. It's just simply a place on the path. But having said that, you folks, I can't imagine you haven't woken up to your soul. I don't think you'd be here if you hadn't. I mean, it seems fair to assume that. And if that's a reasonable assumption, then with that discovery comes a heightened sense of responsibility. In you, in me. Comes a recognition that there's something beyond your own gratification that has to be attended to. There's something about recognizing that you have something to make a contribution to the betterment of something, not for your own personal gain, but for the betterment of something beyond you. That's like fundamental to the path. And so, service is the way of the future. In fact, in this philosophy, there's a group of people around the world that it's called the New Group of World Servers. In fact, the seminar I'll be doing next weekend, it's actually not 2 weeks, but it's next weekend here, a weekend retreat. And it's going to have a lot to do with that. A lot to do with that. But the idea here is that as a whole, that group is called the New Group of World Servers, and their numbers are increasing around the world. And most of them are unconscious of the fact that they're part of an inner group. They're found in, let me define the term for you. New Group of World Servers represents the sum total of all people on the planet today who have had a measure of awakening to their own soul, who have some measure of wanting to commit themselves to bring the best of them forward in service to others, and also are working toward transforming the lower in order to do that more effectively. In total, that's called the New Group of World Servers. They're also called the Light Bringers, and they're also called the Forerunners of the Light, which is what the seminar next weekend is about. It's called the Forerunners of the Light. That group, the future of humanity, and the opportunity for humanity to go through a tremendous initiatory process, which we think could happen this century, rests on the shoulders of the New Group of World Servers. And if you're really not certain who they are, I just have one thing to say. Ta-da! You are. To the extent that your heart is ablazed with the Christ consciousness, to the extent that you feel a need to commit your life to supporting the betterment of something, you are part of that group. And that group, the future, rests on their shoulders. Rests on their shoulders. And it's interesting because we're told the liberated masters, they look at that new group of world servers and they don't see a million people. They see one entity. And they give it another name. They call it the world disciple. The world disciple. And so right now you and your consciousness, you have something that could help. You have something important that could help. You know, there's three terms here. There's gifts, there's talents, and skills. You have gifts. Gifts in this philosophy are said, the word gift is a word that represents abilities that are coming from your soul, trying to express through your personality. Talents are inherent personality skills, and skill is something your personality learns during the course of your life. But it's your gifts. It's your gift. You know, it's so interesting. We talk about soul purpose a lot in this philosophy. And how do we know our soul purpose? And there's many things that we can use to try to understand that. There's astrological indicators, there's rheological indicators. But one of a great master once said this, is that one of the things to help you understand how to serve is to identify your gifts. And it's so interesting when you think about gifts, because often your gift is the thing that other people appreciate more than you yourself. You know, people will say, boy, you really have a wonderful gift. But a lot of times you'll look at it and say, you're so accustomed to it, you don't see it as a gift, it's just the way I am. But it's that gift that is important. And to find out how can you take that gift, or gifts possibly, how can you take that and navigate it into the world in such a way that it does support an upliftment in a more effective way than otherwise? That's so important to identify your gift, and also to identify your scope of interest. You know, another master once said that one of the clues to your soul and its capacity to serve is to recognize the trend of your thinking. Recognize the trend of your thinking. And I mean that in the sense of your interests. I don't mean it in day-to-day thought, but I mean what impassions your thinking. What does your mind always want to go back to over and over and over and again? Because in the middle of that trend of interest and thought is a golden thread. And that's it. Joseph Campbell, who I'm sure you all know, Joseph Campbell once said, he made 3 words famous. Anybody know what it is? Follow your bliss, okay? In esotericism, we would probably phrase that a little differently. I would phrase it this way: follow the trend of your thinking that gives rise to bliss. Follow the trend of your thinking that gives rise to bliss. So, the cry of humanity is very real right now. And the percentage of humanity that is awakened to their soul by comparison is growing, but still small compared to the global population. But your consciousness has a far wider reach than the average person in terms of its potential influence. So I just want you to know that this is your time, friends. This is your time. I mean, and talk about what an interesting time to be alive, really, when you think about it. So, I wanted to introduce you to this idea that you're really here to serve the soul of humanity. And I'd like to also talk about some things that might be helpful for you to be more effective in whatever that service is that you render. So a few little skills here I'd like to share with you in response to the cry of humanity. One of the things is that makes you more effective in support of service is your capacity to see the duality in other things. So for instance, I hear people say, the problem of the world is the business world. You know, it's all about greed. Wait a minute, what about the soul of business? What about the soul of business? There's the personality of business, which has hoarding tendencies, but there's the soul of business. What's the role of the soul of business? In the big picture, it's to support right distribution of resources to ensure the sustenance of all life. Everything is dual, because everything is alive. Everything is a manifestation in form of categories of consciousness. So we want to be able to see beyond the form of something to sense what is the soulful essence behind the form. You see, and that's one of the functions of your third eye. Your third eye has many, many functions, but one of those functions is to look beyond form to sense what is the life force that's struggling to find expression through that form and doing it with different degrees of accuracy and distortion. And it's just like you have a soul that's trying to work through a form called the personality, and just like that personality can have a distorting effect on that soul impulse, we call that the glamours of the path. The same is true everywhere, in everything. So always realize that you're going to be much more effective if you can start to look at what you're serving and sense the difference between it's what presents itself versus what's behind the presentation, which is absolutely sacred and just difficult for most people to see and sense, because you want to serve that soulful essence, not the form. And the form, when I say form, don't think only physical. Emotions are forms. Thoughts are forms. That's why I said your personality is threefold, a mental, emotional, and physical aspect to it. The same is true. In a business, there's a mental component, an emotional component, and a physical component to it, but behind that, there's soulful essence. Same in government, same in politics, same in education. So start to look at things and looking for the duality. And to do that, you have to be able to suspend judgment. That's another one. Because you see, it is said in the ancient literature that the moment you have rapid judgment about something, it closes the third eye. Shut. You have to be able to hold it and suspend judgment in order to see. So realize that those two things work together. The suspension of rapid judgment coupled with a sensitivity to the subtle deep within. Your third eye does many other things as well. It facilitates the recognition of your soul's wisdom. It helps you, it actually regulates your chakra system and helps prepare your chakras for what it is that you're going to bring out into the world, because in the magical subject, another big part of this philosophy of creativity, you actually use your chakras very deliberately in a certain sequence and in a certain way, depending upon what you're doing, and your third eye is going to help galvanize certain chakra patterns to facilitate the expression of what it is you're trying to bring forward. That's third eye as well. It's a big subject, the third eye. Secondly, think in longer units of time. Often we're looking for rapid results, but the bigger picture is to see the great drama of evolution over larger cycles of time. You know, if you just look at what's happened in the last 20, 30 years, I mean, it really looks like it's fallen apart. But go back instead, think in terms of centuries, for instance. Get larger perspective here, because that's what your soul does. Your soul has a longer view. In fact, your soul has a multi-incarnational view. where your lower self doesn't have that. Your personality's perception of time is confined within a single incarnation. The personality only exists within a single incarnation, so it only has a single incarnation as its fundamental litmus test of time. But widen your view instead of, and even in your own work, instead of being preoccupied with what's my goal tomorrow, which is important too, by the way, but ask yourself, what is my objective in terms of service in the next 12 years? 12 years. I'm using 12, it could be 7 or whatever, but 12 is actually quite good because a 12-year cycle is important because it's a Jupiter cycle. Jupiter's a planet that represents 12 years to go around the zodiac. And Jupiter has been a planet, it's a living system, and Jupiter is a planet that emphasizes direction, wisdom, vision, purpose, meaning, meaningfulness. Jupiter is very much about where are you going to bring your life, how are you going to aim your life, in many ways. So a 12-year cycle can be very good in your thinking. Realize that as this, another skill to keep in mind is that as humanity walks across this burning ground, realize that there are some people that are running back. And that's the rise of the fundamentalist thinking. That's the rise of conservative thinking, because they can't handle the coals, and they also don't have a vision of the possibilities of the future as you would. And so the job is not to reject those that are running back, but to try to transform their attitudes so that they recognize that the future is actually a very promising future if we all do it together. So a lot of this has to do with your ability to shape your language, your ability to interface with people in such a way that you can ease their fears and reassure people that what's trying to happen is actually good, but we have to do it together. No one can be left behind. The last weary pilgrim must come home. The cry of humanity is getting louder, friends. Have you noticed? It's getting louder. And it's getting more painful, without a doubt, without a doubt. And there's reasons that I won't get into now where the next few years particularly are going to be challenging. Right up until right around 2025, we've got a lot of crisis still to work through. We're in the middle phase of that 200-year overlap, remember. You are needed now. You are needed now. So please understand that you are also being watched from the greater life. You might say the soul of humanity and the hierarchy of masters are watching. And they're they're looking for who are the serious players, because the New Age movement is filled with people that are wishful in their thinking and progressive in their thinking, but have to learn how to ground it. One of the things to keep in mind, and then I've got to close here, is that I mentioned the 6th ray to 7th ray, but I didn't mention the 7th ray. So let me just tell you what that is. The 7th ray is called the ray of ceremonial order and magic, and it's an energy that tries to ground things. The 7th ray is what's going to help ground spirituality. It is, if the 6th ray has been called, sometimes it's been called the ray of the mystic, where the 7th ray is called the ray of the practical mystic, the practical mystic. Humanity is moving from an age of mysticism to an age of practical mysticism. And so practical mysticism is more than just heart. Practical mysticism is mind and heart committed to grounded outer manifestation. And that's the future. The future is to use your mind and your heart and adopt a commitment to manifest things that make a practical, uplifting contribution. That's the future. So I invite you to recognize that you're part. If you resonate with this at all, if you do, realize you're not alone. I teach in 8 countries around the world. And I see a lot of people just like you who are all awakening to something. And that awakening transcends culture, transcends the differences in our outer world, because internally it's one group, and you're part of it. Thank you for coming. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. All right, everyone. Well, listen, I'd like to close by just first allowing you to just realize how important it is that you are here on this planet right now, and that you're part of a much larger agenda, and that you're essential to that agenda. So I'd like you to, for a moment, just be very still and breathe in, maybe close your eyes, and breathe in. And as you breathe, imagine that every breath you take is going to draw you deeper and deeper into rapport with the inner group, the new group of world servers. And you know that they are found in every country and every social strata. And that together we collectively can help humanity move through this great transition into a new and dawning age of humanity's oneness. And as you hold that alignment, imagine that the quality of Christ-like love is descending now into this room, overshadowing all of us with a quality of loving wisdom. And with a sense of that connectedness always, and a feeling of gratitude for being part of this larger urge to serve, let us close this meditation by collectively chanting the Om 3 times together. Thank you all.
Very good.